Welcome to the Republican Professor. This afternoon, we have with us Charles Kesler. Thank you, Charles, for being here.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. I've never been on a program called The Republican Professor before. So
Well,
is this where Republican professors go to die, or is this the birthplace of Republican professors? What is this
yeah,
podcast?
that's a really good question. It's a question about the future, and I
Yeah.
can't answer that because I haven't seen any of us die yet, but we'll see where it goes. It's pretty new. We The first episode was recorded last year,
Uh-huh.
and but we're picking up steam, and I think we have something like 42 episodes published now.
Wow.
So
Very good.
it's going. Yeah, we've had some pretty interesting interviews. We've had military people on, business.
Uh-huh.
Um, our our audience is eclectic as of right now, as far as I can tell. It's a pretty small but growing audience, curious general audience. But
Mhm.
we interview business entrepreneur people, military, elected officials, academics primarily. Um, but it's basically whomever I'm curious about and whomever I'm interested in talking to. And so you fit right into that because you were one of my favorite professors at Claremont. I had you for 4 courses. One was on Hegel. I think it was called Philosophy of History
Mhm.
back about 10 years ago.
Right.
And one was on the Federalist. That was 8 years ago. And
Yes,
then
I'm
two,
I'm reteaching that one right now.
oh, great. That
We're
was a
2 weeks
wonderful,
away from the end.
the end. Well, I have two of these, and I'm
Uh-huh.
holding up for those who are not watching on YouTube. I'm holding up the Federalist Papers Signet Classics edition, which has the introduction and notes by Charles Kesler, who's our guest today. And I have this. This is my first copy. This was starting to fall apart, so I have a second copy, which I'm beginning to make notes in. And sometimes I don't know which copy I have what note in, but what I love about that edition is it's got a copy of the Constitution, it's got a copy of the Declaration of Independence, and there's cross references with the text of the Federalist and the relevant parts of the Constitution,
Mhm.
which I thought was really enlightened and helpful. And it's also got the Articles of Confederation in there, so you have something to compare it to. When I took it for 2 other courses at CMC, Claremont McKenna College, uh, one was an audit in liberalism and conservatism in the spring of 2016. And it was, I think I was the only graduate student that was sitting in on that class. It was all undergraduates. And I, um, I have a recording, Dr. Kessler, of you predicting that Trump would beat Hillary. And I
Mhm.
believe it was February 23rd. It's not a very good recording, but but it is clear if you listen carefully enough, you can. It's a little bit of a banter with the students,
Uh-huh.
and so a student happened to ask you what do you think would happen, and February 23rd, I think sometime in the afternoon, it's time stamped somehow. Uh, you said that you thought that Trump would beat Hillary. You predicted that February 23rd, 2016,
Well,
to the shock and horror of some of the students in that class.
yes. Well,
And I was a little surprised too at the time,
yeah.
but then you gave a rationale, and the rationale made sense to me. So
What was the rationale?
I believe it was that she had a glass jaw, I'm pretty sure I had that right, that she was just vulnerable, and he had the type of personality that wouldn't be held back. And
Yes, right.
and then I think something about the states that he won, like Michigan.
Mhm.
I'm not sure if that my memory is correct on that, but um, so you have that.
I did say the same thing that month. I don't know whether it was earlier or later, to a group of people in Washington D.C. Uh, and I recall the reaction was even stronger than in the classroom in
Hmm.
Claremont,
Wow.
and there was almost literally, wailing and gnashing of teeth. But
Well,
I thought it was correct at the time. It seemed to be likely. So I guess I was happy to be right.
yeah.
But um,
Well,
it
I remember where I
it's sort of a
was.
one. I think
Yeah.
hard to reproduce
Yes,
that victory a second
that's right.
time.
That's right.
And not only in 2020, but I think it would be hard in 2024 as well. But um,
Hmm.
we've still got a way to go.
Right. Well, I remember where I was when I realized that you might have been right that time. I was in Los Angeles. I was teaching as an adjunct professor at Cal State Northridge, which is in the
Uh-huh.
city of Los Angeles. And I was in a gun store just waiting traffic out, just mainly watching people. I was just interested in who was going into these gun stores and what they were doing. And I there was kind of a panic, uh, and there was a very diverse crowd in this particular store, sporting goods store. I think it was called Turner's Outdoorsman, and it was in Pasadena, I believe it
Uh-huh.
was.
Yes.
And there were some Arab guys there. There was, I think, a lesbian couple. There was Mexican, Hispanic. I mean, it was a very diverse crowd there. And it was later in the evening, and I was about to get back on the highway, and I happened to ask, how's it going? How bad is it?
Mhm.
And on the election, because I hadn't looked at the news at all. And the guy said, "Oh, it looks like Trump is winning."
Mhm.
And he said it loud enough for the whole store to hear. And
Yeah.
it was crowded, and the whole store became quiet.
Mhm.
And but it was a kind of quiet that was a hopeful, buoyant quiet. That was my interpretation of it. And I'll never forget it, because I at that moment I remembered your prediction, and I thought, I wonder if Kesler is right, that he's going to pull it off. So that's my story. You're quite a few years ago you wrote this book, I Am the Change, Barack Obama, and was the first title The Crisis of Liberalism? Was it,
Yes,
they
the
changed the
hardcover
title?
title is The Crisis, and then the paperback, which came out a few months
Yeah.
after the 2012 election, um, at the advice of the of the publisher, I changed the subtitle to Barack Obama and the Future of Liberalism. But
Yes.
none of
Okay.
the
I
arguments
remember.
changed.
Okay.
So
Well, this book came out 10 years ago. I guess this is the 10-year anniversary of this book.
yes,
It
I
just
guess that's
occurred to
right.
me.
Yes,
It just occurred to me.
that's right.
Um, I'm emailing back and forth with Hadley Arcus about his book that came out 20 years ago, Natural Right and the Right to Choose.
Hmm.
And I pointed out that it was 20 years ago that that book came out, and he had not thought about it. He said, "Oh, it's been 20 years. I can't believe it. This is just this past week." And I said, "I noticed that you dedicated it to Michael Ullman."
Uh-huh.
And he was a mentor of mine for over a decade, before his untimely passing, sudden passing. And So I'm trying to get Hadley to come on and talk about that book and the dedication to
Oh,
Ullman.
good.
But I asked you on originally to talk about your latest book, Crisis of the Two Constitutions, which is, it seems like it's thicker than I Am the Change. Looking at it, it seems like it's
Yes, it
got a
is.
lot more bulk to it.
Yeah.
And you say to the memory of Harry Jaffa, Tom Silver, and Peter Schramm.
Right.
So tell us how you came about this book, and what did you want to do with this book, Crisis of the Two Constitutions?
Well, this was a book in which which began. Some of the book is new, and some of it is old. And I began with the idea of collecting previously published things along sort of three themes that fit together as one. And as I got into it, and as COVID hit, just as I was writing it, I decided I might as well take all the old stuff and update it a bit, and rewrite it, smooth it out some, and then write some new things to add to it and fill in some gaps in the argument. So the book is substantially refreshened from what it would have been. And it's the themes are simple. The themes are the founding, which is the first third of the book, you might say, then the rise of modern American politics and the progressive movement and its 20th century successors. And then the third part is sort of the conservative reaction to the rise of liberalism. And the conceit I use in the book is really that Americans are so dyspeptic about politics these days because they have some fundamental disagreements
Yes.
that are widening and deepening. And so you have a kind of, it's the usual rule is one constitution per customer, per country. But we in a way have two that are battling it out. And the first one is what I call the conservative constitution, or really the founders' constitution, which we is the original from 1787, but as amended, 27 amendments over the years, versus the liberals' constitution, which they call the living constitution.
Yeah.
And we usually hear about the living constitution in judicial confirmation hearings, when senators ask judges or would-be justices, do you believe in the living constitution, or do you believe in originalism or some other synonym of the opposite one? And so I think the ordinary person's view might be that these two constitutions are judicial constructions, or they're really of concern mostly to judges. And I disagree with that. I think that they are, in fact, just as much ideas that guide the executive and the legislative branches as the judicial branch. And in fact, they're more fundamental in a way in respect of the political branches than of the judicial branch, even though you hear about them more in regard to whichever poor justice is up for confirmation
Yeah.
at a time.
The first part there is the founders' constitution. And then the second part is the progressives' constitution. Then you have another third part, conservatives and the two constitutions.
Right.
Which that part might be worth the price of the book right there, that last part. I'm maybe it'd be helpful to set the stage a little bit. I mentioned one of the courses I took from you was a liberalism and conservatism, I believe it was called.
Yes.
How do you define conservative versus progressive?
Well, progressive. Let me go back one stage and say that the old Republican Party before the New Deal, Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party, William McKinley's Republican Party, didn't use the term conservative very often in respect of themselves. They thought of themselves often, at least, as the liberal party, and by liberal they meant the liberalism as in the Declaration of Independence, or in John Locke, or in sort of the tradition of individual liberty and rule of law.
Did they use that term? Did Lincoln use the term liberal?
Yes, as an adjective. He didn't use the term thematically. He didn't use liberalism in quite the way that we use liberalism, but that word existed too. And liberalism is, of course, a virtue. Generosity or liberalism is an very old-fashioned virtue, not just Christian or religious, but secular too. Aristotle has generosity or liberalism as liberality as one of the virtues that every human being should strive for. And so in that sense, to be liberal has always been a good thing. It meant being generous, being spirited, large-hearted. And
that's right.
That was, you could say, the polarity between freedom and slavery was so strong in American politics in the 19th century that the meaning of liberal or liberalism was washed through that associated distinction. So what happened was in the early part of the 20th century, the progressives regarded liberalism as backward-looking and somewhat old-fashioned, but in need of updating. And so the great divide comes in the early 20th century between those progressives who regard themselves as the new liberals, that is the updated, with it 20th century model of liberalism, and those progressives who prefer not to be called liberals at all, because to the extent that liberalism meant rule of law, property, individual freedom, limited government, consent of the governed, all of those ideas associated, say, with limited government,
those would be called liberal.
Those would be backward-looking.
Yeah. So the liberalism of that, under that understanding, you mentioned property rights, limited government,
right,
enumerated powers. That would be considered the old liberalism.
That was the old liberalism, which wasn't fit for purpose anymore. And so liberals sort of divided as to what they should do, whether they should become progressives or radicals or something else, and continue to attack liberalism as the old-fashioned limited government superstition that they regarded it as. But then when FDR came along, he had a brilliant political insight, which was that he ought to proclaim that the Democratic Party is the new party of liberalism, and that republicanism is not about, capital R, Republican Partyism is not about freedom, equality, and human flourishing, really. But it was an old-fashioned, backward-looking, and niggardly, sort of stinting human philosophy. And FDR gave a series of speeches in 38 in the campaign, and a few even before that, in which he made the argument that his was the party of what he called militant liberalism. And those speeches worked. I mean, the Democrats began to call themselves liberals, and the American people slowly began to call the Democrats liberals as well. And when that happened, all the opponents of the New Deal, who had, like Herbert Hoover, who had always thought of himself as a liberal, suddenly were homeless. They had no name to describe themselves. And so they took up the name conservative, faute de mieux, because they had nothing better. And in fact, it was, to add insult to injury, it was FDR's idea. He suggested to them that they should call themselves conservatives, because from his point of view, they were trying to conserve an old and dying world, and not embrace the new new world that was a-borning,
Wow. You have a chapter called The Three Waves of Liberalism. And I recognize that material from your book from 10 years ago on Barack Obama, where you go through the different phases of liberalism. The FDR phase, that would have been, which wave of liberalism would that be?
That's the second wave.
Second wave, yeah.
Yeah, what I call first wave liberalism was basically the progressive era. So that's the second decade of the 20th century. And then the 1930s, that's the third wave. That's the New Deal, wave, Great Depression wave. And the 60s is the third wave, the beginning of the third wave.
And this is tied with another theme that you have, which is the administrative state.
Yes.
This is tied in with that somehow, the growth of the administrative state. We think of the New Deal. Well, maybe people don't know, but to refresh your mind for those listening, the New Deal was an incredibly expansive growth in government.
Yes.
Regulating the economy in ways that had never been regulated before to that extent, like defining what a work week was and how much you could negotiate for in no case, in terms of the minimum wage, in no case will it be legal for you to take a job that pays under that. It would be illegal now. Those kind of things, and then arms of government to enforce that, basically.
No, that's right. And what were sometimes called social and economic rights, or socioeconomic rights, which Roosevelt wrapped up in a neat package that he called the Second Bill of Rights. And the Second Bill of Rights had all these things which are now very central to our politics and have been for 90 years, let's say. Things like the right to health care, a right to a job, right to a good education, those kinds of things, which are not in the original Bill of Rights, and are in a somewhat and certainly ambivalent relationship to the first Bill of Rights, but which are really probably more important now than the first Bill of Rights. Our politics is more about how much we spend in order to deliver healthcare and education and all of these good things, which cost a lot and carry with them all kinds of restrictions. And so that's, our politics is, we're sort of divided between those two constitutional bills of rights, the original one, part of the original Constitution, and the second Bill of Rights, which is really part of the second Constitution.
You have a chapter in the first part, the Founders Constitution, about education, which I thought was interesting as an educator. Perpetuating the Republic, Education and Politics. What does education have to do with the crisis of the two constitutions?
Well, that's a very good question, Lucas. Well, my view of the founding is to look at it, to begin looking at it as a founding, that is, as an attempt to start something new and perpetuate it. And that means obviously the new form of government, the new Constitution creates a presidency and a Supreme Court, two houses of Congress, and all that sort of thing, which is standard fare. But the same sort of new beginnings that take place inside of government are carried on outside of government in different ways.
Yes.
And one of the ways is by a movement which begins at the end of the founding, basically, and continues for several generations into and across the 19th century to create public education in America. There were no public schools or common schools in America to begin with, except in New England. It was a Puritan thing for the most part, and it didn't spread. It began to spread, however, down towards the Midwest and the middle states of the Union before the Civil War, and after the Civil War, it spread into the South as well. But the whole notion that you would create free public schools that eventually children would be compelled to attend for a certain number of years, and that would have the backing of parents, that they would have, parents would be involved in some way in the running of them, and all of that, that you would create a whole system of education in order to do two things, at least, in order to help everyone learn the basics, of reading, writing, and arithmetic, and a few other things, so that they could be economically self-sufficient as individual citizens and family members. And secondly, that the other big object they were seeking was to turn the citizens of America into Republican citizens, into reliably patriotic and intelligent citizens. And so in that sense, the Republican Professor podcast was is part of a long tradition of turning out non-monarchists and anti-monarchists who can govern themselves and be proud of governing themselves democratically, small d and small r.
Yes. It reminds me of a quote that you had in that chapter. I think it was at the end. The last section of that chapter on education, it has a section called Dead White Males, page 117, 118, I think is the quote. And you say, in today's academy, Washington and Lincoln are dismissed as dead white males whose educational relevance to a multicultural world is nil. The truth, however, is very nearly the opposite. The true liberalism and genuine cosmopolitanism of these great men have never been more needed in American education and in American politics. But who will educate the educators? And that's how you end
Yes.
that chapter. Do you
Yes,
take it?
unfortunately, I think that's true, still true.
Yeah.
It the you know the I've been attacking, criticizing the 1619 project. It seems ever since 1619. Seems like it's been a long time, but it only popped up a couple of years ago. But it's very representative of a lot of elite opinion about the founders and about dead white males. Which is that the world has moved beyond that, and white males are not all dead, but their civilization is in a way dead, or revealed as exploitative and oppressive, and so that no one in his right mind would think about returning to the principles of dead white males. Because those principles everyone understands those principles are corrupt and false. But of course, they don't actually. That hasn't been demonstrated. It's
Right.
simply asserted and said over and over again with great moral intensity. But it's far from being true or proven true. So I think the argument is very much alive, but you have to awaken people. I mean, people are
Yes.
very woke now, but yet they're not awake, intellectually as they need to be.
I've had an opportunity to observe you primarily in the classroom for many years, read your writings. Of course, you're the editor of the Claremont Review of Books, and you always have uh, a short essay at the very beginning that's always timely and delightfully written. uh,
Thank you.
yeah,
Thank you.
refreshing to read, always insightful. And I don't think of you as a hateful person. That doesn't enter my mind. I don't think that's ever entered my mind. The thought that you might be a racist or engaged in some kind of, or even that you would even tolerate such a thing.
Mhm.
What do you obviously believe deeply in the founding principles and Lincoln principles of Lincoln.
Mhm.
You believe in America. um, what do you say to people that would simply accuse it of being racist? Is there how do you approach that when it seems like it's just rhetoric?
Well, I mean, I understand the charge, uh, because I mean, there's a lot of racism in American history,
Yes.
and there was, I mean, this was a slave society, or at least half of it, or more or less, um, for several centuries, and we shouldn't forget that. But it's um, I I find the best way to try to talk to people who have that opinion that America is racist, but have not stopped thinking about the issue, is to really just talk to them about American history and about what America is about and what it has done and the crimes it's guilty of and the but also the magnificent achievements and the heroic personalities that it has given birth to as well. And so I don't think you took one course you didn't take from me is Gov 20, which is the introductory American politics course, which I've taught for almost 40 years now at CMC. And in that course, I always teach, among other things, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And we read, a couple hundred pages of Lincoln and a couple hundred pages of Douglas. And in that, and one of the points I make these days when I teach it is, look, there is such a thing as white supremacy. And Stephen Douglas believes in what we would call white supremacy, that the America was founded on the white basis for the sake of white people, by white people, for their children and grandchildren and their successors, and the blacks have nothing to do with it and can't have anything to do with it. And that I think it's good to confront that. It's real. This was a dominant political opinion in America for a long time in some ways, but that it was opposed by Abraham Lincoln, who argued, in very difficult times, which in which in many ways race prejudice of a very virulent sort was front and center in American life. He argued quite courageously and clearly, it seems to me at least, that all men are created equal, and whatever the the distribution of ability and talent and among people and among races was, it had nothing to do with their humanity and with their possession of rights, and especially the right to count as an equal, and to have their own life, liberty, and property protected equally by government. So, when you reach out to people at least halfway and show them what's true about the notion of white supremacy, and that, however, everything can't be equally white supremacy. If you've got Lincoln and Douglas debating fundamentally over the morality and the truth of the idea of white supremacy. And so that, I think, is the beginning. It's only the beginning, but it's the beginning of a way to see America as a whole and not just as a part, and to recover a reasonable love of country, of the sort that Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington and many other Black leaders over the centuries, including Martin Luther King, well understood and explained many times in American history.
Do you think that the reason why such sentiments are so popular, or at least they seem to be so popular, are that folks that hold those sentiments or appear to hold them just haven't thought about them, haven't been pushed back on it, haven't had an interlocutor like yourself who is so, what they used to call, nuanced?
Well, yes, maybe.
I remember used to call that nuance.
But the quality of public discussion in America today is not particularly high about on anything, and this has not been a great generation for public men, and women. You know, I mean, if you look at the progressives, if you look at the sort of post-World War II generation of American public officials, there are some very, very bright and learned and serious people in those generations. And there are some around today as well, don't get me wrong, but they don't seem to have a leading place or a dominant, or let's say, impressive place in our public conversations. And so I understand,
Right.
you know, if someone is shouting at you, it's tempting to shout back at them, but you don't get very far that
No.
way. And the only kind of victory you can win is to outshout the other side.
Yeah, that's definitely not a way forward. I noticed that your book doesn't have anything about the Equal Rights Amendment in there. Speaking of women, so we talked a little bit about racism, maybe talk a little bit about women and what women might be interested in finding. How do they choose between the two constitutions?
It's interesting you mentioned that. I don't, you know, even
I'm assuming you know what a woman is. So maybe
no,
I should.
but even
We had to get that out of the way.
I'm responding from an author's position, because I immediately began to think, don't I mention? I thought I mentioned somewhere that the amazing defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s. If I didn't, I probably should have.
It's possible,
but I was going to
that
say
it's possible I missed that
partial
it's not in the
defense that indexes are still drawn up by human beings.
That's right. That's right.
I don't know why this is so, but apparently you can't get a program that will draw up a decent index. Maybe it's too effective, or it includes everything.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I may have missed that. Yeah.
No, I after a while you forget what you wrote exactly. But I think it's the question of the women's question, of course, which has always been an important part of, and in a way a complement to the race question in America.
Yeah.
And from the earliest part of American history, from the early 19th century to the early 20th century to the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s, there have always been sort of parallel movements of women's liberation and Black liberation or other race liberation. And one can understand why, because there's a sort of, they both come out in a way of the Declaration of Independence and of the notion that all men who are created equal are not all men. They're also women, because they form a species, and you need women and men to make a species. And so we know that that's the case. That women are not forgotten in the Declaration of Independence. They were even mentioned at least once, if not more than once, in the discussion of Indian warfare, and the undistinguished destruction of men, women, and children. I think it says something like that in the text of the Declaration, indicating that women and children have rights. Not to be killed indiscriminately or unjustly, just like men have those rights. So, yes, I think it's confusing, the story of women's liberation, because it's more open-ended than race in a way. And it's there's probably more of convention mixed with nature in matters of sex or gender, as we say, today
Yeah,
than in
right.
cases of race, although there's convention mixed in with nature in both areas, I think. So I don't,
Yeah.
yes, I don't really write much about that, but I don't write about foreign policy at all. So there's a lot of
Yes.
American politics that is not in this book.
Fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. I thought I would throw it out there just because you mentioned
No,
women.
no, it's a good question.
Um, well, one of the courses I had with you, I don't think I mentioned it, was a course called The Natural Law, CMC 2016.
Uh-huh.
There's a lot of philosophy in your background. How did you did you study that in your PhD? Did you study
Well,
with Mansfield?
yes,
What's your
I'm a
background?
Harvard uh,
Mhm.
uh,
Harvard
I'm
product,
a Harvard man.
Harvard
Because
man.
a Harvard man, yes, a Harvard man. This is not widely known outside of Harvard, but a Harvard man, technically, I don't know what that means, but anyway, basically, it's accepted that a Harvard man is a Harvard undergraduate. If you have
Gotcha.
a PhD or a master's or the equivalent from Harvard, you're not quite a Harvard man
Ah,
in the full undergraduate sense of the term. You're, I don't know what you are. You're a Harvard something. You're a Harvard person. You're a Harvard, I don't know. You're a student of Harvard or something like that.
Harvard
But no, I
spirit.
got all my degrees at Harvard, so in
Gotcha.
that sense, I'm a full product. But I studied with Harvey Mansfield among and Judith Sklar, among others, in political philosophy, and also with Ed Banfield and James Q. Wilson and other people in American politics, Sam Huntington as well.
Who was
It
the
was quite a
primary
good, it was
influence on
quite
you?
a good department in those days. So
What
I
was
was
the
lucky.
lady's name? Jan something?
Pardon?
Jan. What was the lady's name you mentioned? Jan
Oh,
something?
Judith
Oh,
Sklar,
Judith.
Shklar.
Okay. And so, who was the most influential on you? Can you pick somebody, or was it
Well,
a combination?
probably Mansfield, because I took more of his courses.
All right. I just want to know who my intellectual grandfather is, because there's you, and then, I know
Well,
Jaffa
the
through Uelman, and I
yeah,
know,
yeah. The amazing thing about Harvey is that he just turned 90, and
wow,
he's still teaching. He's
wow,
still actively on the faculty, um,
wow.
and teaching. As far as I know, a full load, but he's certainly teaching.
What was he like as a professor? Did you get the C minus Harvey Mansfield thing from him?
Well, of course, he was. Yeah, his nickname was C minus Harvey Mansfield, because he crusaded against grade inflation, of which
Yeah,
there is quite a bit and is quite a bit, even more now.
yeah.
Do you know what the most commonly given grade at Harvard University is right now?
I'm going to take a wild guess and say it's an A minus.
Yes, A minus.
Okay.
And the second most commonly given grade is A.
Now, was
I mean,
that
the last
was
time
that
I
the
checked, it was,
case?
and then B plus.
Was
So
that the case
uh,
when you were there, though? Do you think?
it was on its way to that. I don't think it
On
was
its way.
quite there yet,
Okay.
but it was moving up. Yes. Um,
Do you
but
how do
Harvey was, he was an amazing lecturer.
mm,
Probably the best, uh, consistently the best lecturer I've ever heard. Every class was um, dazzling in some way, or in multiple ways. And he was he had his own expansive scholarly project, really, but he
mhm.
was also he was just very good at teaching you how to read, read
Yes.
philosophically,
Yes.
which is different from just reading. It's reading at a very high intensity, um, and he showed you how to do that the only way you can, really, by example.
Now, I've always thought of you as a strong lecturer. When I think of you and your courses. That's what I think of. Do you think that you got that appreciation for a really strong lecture from him?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I had a lot of good, I had a lot of very smart teachers and good teachers, but I don't think any of them was a better lecturer than Mansfield. But somebody like Harry Jaffa, who was never formally a teacher of mine, and he was not at Harvard, he was at Claremont. I learned a lot from him, obviously, just from being around him and listening to him. But he was not nearly as systematic a teacher, I would say, as Harvey was. He was capable of giving a good lecture, but most of the time he improvised, much more so than Harvey would have, or for that matter, Judith Sklar.
Did Mansfield dialogue much in the classroom like Jaffa might?
Well, I would say Jaffa's strength was in dialogue and in debate, in conversation, not so much in lecturing. And Harvey's was in lecturing, not so much in dialoguing and conversation.
That matches what I thought. I don't think this interview would be complete if we didn't talk about the conservatives and the two constitutions. You have a chapter on Reagan. You have something on the Bush doctrine there.
Yes. Oh, that's right. I guess I take back my earlier
yes,
declaration of
that's right.
non-involvement in foreign policy. I do have a whole chapter really on foreign policy in that.
Yeah.
In that sense, yeah.
What are we to learn about Bush and the Bush doctrine from this?
Well, the Bush doctrine was, as it began life as a reaction, of course, to 9/11, right. And it was a justified, a righteous indignation over the evil done on that day to the United States and its citizens. But it was unfortunately not thought through, I guess you could say. Mm-hmm. It was not statesmanlike in the end. It was it lacked the sobriety and the realism of the best of American foreign policy in our tradition. And I focus in that piece on the second inaugural address, which is Bush's sort of maximum statement about the necessity to democratize many parts of the world in order to tame them, right. And liberate them and solve the problem of terrorism by eliminating injustice, essentially, which is an understandable response, but not a reasonable policy, and one that was doomed, I thought, from the beginning, because of that. And so right after 9/11, I asked Angelo Codevilla, who died just last year, who was a great professor of foreign policy and international relations, among other things. And it was a Ph.D. from Claremont, from the Claremont Graduate School back in the, I guess, late 60s. He must have gotten it, or early 70s. I asked him to undertake a column, which we called Victory Watch. And in the very first issue after 9/11, we had the cover story was a meditation on what it would take to win this war that we were now embarked on. And it was very unclear what that war was going to be. This is before really the invasion of Afghanistan, long before the invasion of Iraq.
Was this in 2001?
It was obviously going to be something big. And we both felt quite apprehensive that, like as in many other times in the 20th century, America would go to war with a righteous cause, but a losing battle plan, a losing strategy. And the ignominiousness of our withdrawal from Afghanistan finally under President Biden is sort of we couldn't have predicted it in all of its sort of shameful detail, but we knew something very bad would probably come out of the whole experience, and nothing that could really be called victory in the end.
That column you're referring to, was that in 2001 that it was published?
That was in 2001. Yes,
gotcha.
It was
probably the fall
quarter. whatever the I forget what date was on the issue, but it would have come out right after 9/11.
That strikes me as your assessment of the Bush doctrine. But why can't Trump say it that well? that he didn't say it near as well, but he seemed like he has kind of on a gut level that same sentiment that you had. Would you say that's correct?
Well, yes, I guess. I mean, I don't know exactly. I mean, I don't know Trump personally, and although I've spent a little time with him in a room with many other people, but yes, I think he said something which I think was wrong, which is, I mean, he famously called the invocation of weapons of mass destruction by President Bush and by the Secretary of Defense at the time a lie, and I think that's wrong. I don't think they were lying. I think the intelligence was wrong, but it was everyone understood that that's what the intelligence said, or they thought that's what the intelligence was telling them. And that's not just us, that's the British and the French and the Germans as well. As I say, we were wrong about that, and maybe we should have known that it was likely to be wrong, but it wasn't a lie. And I think it's wrong to say that to blame Bush for deliberately getting us into a losing war in order to, for whatever sort of imperial reasons Trump was implying there. I mean, I knew Rumsfeld slightly, and he did not strike me as a guy who would ever would lie in such a matter, and certainly not one so irresponsible as to continue to lie, if it or to speak untruths if he found that they were not true.
I think it was the former Secretary of State Colin Powell that seemed to think it was a lie later or something. I don't know.
Yes, well, he felt he'd been used, manipulated into going with data or whatever that he he distrusted or later distrusted. I'm not sure which.
You had I just interviewed a former student of yours, Lance Robinson, who was active duty during that time in the Air Force. I think he was a lieutenant colonel at the time. He had flown combat missions over Iraq, and he agrees that it was not a lie. It was based on faulty information, and but it was not a lie. How are we supposed to understand Trump? Do you have a couple of chapters more or less about Trump? You have a chapter called "The Trump and the Conservative Cause," and one of the the sections of that is just simply called President Trump. Political correctness. And then another chapter you have after that is thinking about Trump, morality, politics, and the Constitution. You've
Right.
obviously thought about this. You did predict that he would win. So
Yes, and
can you tell people about Trump?
I did vote for him twice. He was not my candidate going into the 2016 election. I was backing, my wife and I were backing Scott Walker. Scott Walker, the governor.
Oh, yes. Stood up to the unions.
And he, I think, was the first candidate to drop out of the race. So that shows you how much I know and how much, you should stock you should put in my intelligence. But he dropped out. But I liked him. I thought he'd been a very good governor, courageous governor, and but he was not ready for this race. I mean, he was in the governor's mindset, and he really didn't have a chance to catch his breath, I think, and sort of begin a presidential race. And so he was out of it before he even began it almost. But I do think that, Trump was probably the only candidate of the 16 or 17 who could have beaten Hillary. And the others there were some very good and well-qualified people among them. I mean, governors, senators. Jeb Bush was, there were things about him I liked as well, and some of the other candidates too. But I just don't think they could have beaten her. I mean, the progressive wave was quite high at that point. And the idea that you would have a second Obama presidency, basically. So you'd have not just the 8 years of President Obama, but 8 more years of a progressive to complete the revolution, so to speak, complete the transformation, as he called it, of the United States of America. That was a real political program. I mean, that's more or less what would have happened, I think, if she had won, and she was very likely to have won against anybody else. It took someone who was able to break through, you might say, the ice of American politics, the frozen forces in American politics, to dethrone her. And so it was only Trump, I think, who could have done it. Now he, I said in the beginning that Trump had an obligation to get serious, and that he couldn't just think that he could become president and do it as like a weekend job or something, and all would come out correctly. And I think it took him a long time to realize, if he ever realized, how difficult the job is, how serious the job is. And that was disappointing. And I think that was he didn't rise as he should have risen. However, he was still a pretty good president. I mean, in terms of his domestic and foreign policy, he produced a lot of very good public policy for the country. If he had, I think his biggest mistake, of course, was, and I have a lot of friends who disagree with me about this, but I think his biggest mistake was maintaining that he had the election stolen from him, and then allowing that. But even so, he could still have made that argument, and then at the end simply said graciously, I've lost it.
Sure,
they stole it fair and square. Well, better luck next time. And left office, and he would have been in a much better position in history's eyes, and also in the voters' eyes, perhaps in 2024, than he may be. But taking the route he took, and then speaking at the Ellipse rally and launching the whole January 6th disaster. He left office having really botched
Yeah.
the end of his presidency.
Do you
And
think
he didn't
that's
have to
just,
do that. I mean,
yeah,
he could have left in a much better way than he did.
one of the virtues that he claimed to have in running was that he wasn't a politician, and yet it seems like a politician would have avoided some of those things because politicians actually care what people think.
Yes,
Um,
right.
so it's ironic that, well, first of all, it's ironic anybody who claims not to be a politician is running for office, but but he did he ever was he supposed to have become a politician? Is that would that have fixed the problem, you think, if he would have
Well,
just become a
I mean,
politician?
when um, when a modern American politician um, denies he's a politician, that usually means he's a conservative.
Yes. Oh,
Is
that's very,
not
very good said.
by a politician,
Very
he
well said.
means he's not a member in good standing of the administrative state.
Hmm.
Or to put it differently, he's on the people's side, not the government side, or he's on the country
Right.
side,
Right.
not the court side. And that's all politically understandable. That doesn't mean, however, that um, you shouldn't prepare yourself to be a statesman
Right.
and to take seriously the duty you're undertaking when
Yes.
you run for a high public office. In a way, it means you have to prepare all the more seriously if you're eschewing the more usual appointed positions and or service in the endless Congress or whatever.
In terms of
Look at
Trump,
Reagan. I mean, Reagan was
yeah,
very
yeah,
much like this. That he in 1980
yes.
he ran basically against the government. And again in 1984, he was not a politician. He was the people's candidate. He was his tropes are just as populist as almost anything that Trump came up with. And in fact, Trump's slogan, let's make America great again, was Reagan's slogan in 1980 and in 1984. He used exactly the same wording and the same, rallying cry. It's true he didn't have the hats.
Right.
He
You mentioned
didn't have MAGA,
when you
but
mentioned
but
the
he had
MAGA thing.
he. I
Yeah.
mean, the similarities.
Right.
One doesn't want to go too far in
Right.
pressing this, but the similarities between Reagan's campaigns and Trump's are impressive at one level. Now they're very different people, very different personalities, and
Yes.
Reagan had been a successful two-term governor of California.
Yeah. Oh, that's a big difference, actually.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, you
And it's
mentioned
crazy. I mean, if one were legislating,
right.
one would not want to encourage candidates for president to make that their first political race. They've never
Yeah.
had an office or sought an office before is kind of
Yeah.
what would you say dangerous or risky. Yeah.
Regarding the MAGA slogan, I hear quite often just a really quick retort that assumes that America was great at some point. When was America great? And I know you
Yeah.
refer to that in your book. You say that assumes that America was great at some
Yes.
point. I guess I could ask you that question: was America ever great? I'm assuming I'm going to get a very nuanced answer to that.
Well, no, I think
like everything you say is nuanced.
Yes, no. Great, of course, doesn't mean perfect. But does America represent a great idea or set of ideas? Has it achieved great political things? Has it had great political figures gracing its history? I think the answer to those questions is all yes. I mean, we've also had some very, evil, or at least um, um, backward political figures too. too. But overall, the story of the country has been one of the affirmation of some great and noble ideas,
You
or at
don't
least
think
a
that
partial affirmation.
you don't think that Trump was a racist, do you?
Um, well,
What do you
no,
think
I
about
don't
that?
think Trump was I mean, I don't think Trump's problem was that he was a racist. I don't know
Yeah,
what his I don't know what his personal ideas were. He, he was he struck me as like a lot of people in that generation whom I'd known, whose language was not that of an assistant professor up for tenure, but
right.
who, came from a rougher walks of life. And, I mean, Trump's a guy who knew his way around a construction uh, um, uh, site. And he knew working people sort of the old type, doing physical labor, skilled labor. And of course, he also knew Hollywood and a lot of the flattering arts of late modernity as well. He's an unusual guy, but but it seems to me that the school of thought that says basically America's problem and the problem of every American is racism is a very narrow and um, unperceptive point of view, actually.
Charles, what's the problem with conservatism? What's wrong with it? You have a chapter. What's wrong with conservatism? And you have a section in here, in search of
Yeah,
conservative principles.
well, I
What are we
mean,
conserving?
yes, the problem with conservatism is um, it's more conservative um, than is good for it. That is, it couldn't. It likes all the arguments which shy away from claims of justice, um, and in favor of arguing about efficiencies and economies and utilities. And I mean, in the sense of utility functions, and it's interested in disagreeing about things that are not uh, that disagreeable about. I mean,
Right.
it's it's depoliticized in many ways. And so the problem with the conservatism in its at its heyday, let's say in Reagan's time, was that it couldn't really see a way to um, uh, so to speak, start the country over again. I don't mean that literally, but to sort of break with with liberalism as a comprehensive public philosophy, and as um, uh, um, the theory of the administrative state. And it conservatism likes for history to be continuous and smooth flowing, um, and is not really about it's not really about going back. It's about going forward slowly um,
It's a
and
nice phrase.
gradually. It's a kind of gradualism. which is fine for many things, but not for everything and not for the most important things. And I think that's when Reagan, in his farewell address, sort of came to the painful subject of what he had failed to do. And he took credit mostly for very positive things. I mean, after all, he was a quite successful president by most measures. He took credit for those things modestly, thanking the American people for helping him start the economy again and help to set the Soviet Union on the course to eventual defeat and a few other things. But he, including sort of a new patriotism in the country, but he admitted that the one thing he really had failed to do was institutionalize that new patriotism. And he left office in a changed America, he said, in a different country from the one he grew up in, which is a very interesting thing to say. And it's in a way a very damaging or surprising admission that the country is not the same country that you grew up in, and that it's not going to be the same country in the sense that he couldn't find a way back to what he called unambivalent patriotism. You know, it's the country was flying the flag everywhere. There's a kind of open patriotic season in the 80s from coming out of his terms in office. But he knew, basically, he admitted that it wasn't the second American Revolution that he needed to produce. He hadn't been able to change the universities and the grade schools and the high schools and the culture of the country. And maybe no one could have done it. And I think it's more important to keep alive the ambition to do it, and to think about, study how it might be done, than it is simply to lament not having done it, because I don't think it's a fate. I mean, I don't think, modern liberalism will last forever. Things change in politics, and even things that seem unchangeable can change very quickly, as we found in the collapse of the Soviet Union, which, after all, didn't lose a major war, didn't have, I mean, the system was working more or less as well as it had ever worked. And yet it had lost the one thing most needful, the system's belief in itself. Solzhenitsyn used to say this: there are no believing communists left in the Soviet Union. They're all at Berkeley and NYU and God knows where else.
You've always struck me as an optimistic person. Are you that way? Well, first of all, is that true? And if it is, are you that way by nature? Is it just that you have extra serotonin in your brain, or is there some hope that you have? Because so many conservatives, so many Republicans, so many independent people that would just say, I'm an independent. They would, they strike me as curmudgeon, or they strike me as sad. Not so much angry as, I think, underneath an anger is, which oftentimes gets misinterpreted as racism or something like that. It's just a sadness at a perceived unstoppable degradation of something they love.
Yes. Well, no, I mean, I have had, on the whole, a very happy life, and I'm very lucky in my family and in my friends and in my education. And I certainly am grateful for all of that, and don't, I hope, underprize it. It's not, not everyone is lucky like that. But at the same time, as an analyst, I think, that there are a lot of signs that liberalism is getting old, and that there's a lot of decay in modern politics and in the modern state. That doesn't necessarily mean that liberalism will be replaced by something better than liberalism. Oftentimes things are replaced by worse things. Yet it raises, it at least penetrates the delusion that nothing can change, or that this is a kind of fate or inevitability that has fallen upon us, and that will never get off of us. That I don't believe. I don't think anything is really inevitable in politics, in the strong sense of the term inevitable. There is a lot of play in the joints. There's a lot of indeterminacy. There's a lot of ways in which chance continues to affect politics profoundly. And so I don't feel as though we are perched on a cliff and are about to go over. I don't know what comes next, but I can imagine some better things to come, and I can see how, or at least in part, they might get here. Whether they will or not, it can't be predicted. I mean, it depends on what people do, and the decisions they make, and the votes they take, and what's going to happen, what war is going to start next, because I think there will be another war at some point, and maybe a big one, but who knows whether it's going to be in the next year, the next 10 years, or the next 100 years. I don't think we can say. It's interesting to see how the Federalist handles this question. They basically, Hamilton has it both ways. I forgot now exactly which number this is in, but at one point he says, I think Madison says actually, that the greatest expenses in politics are always wars. Wars and the associated costs of defense. And compared to that, everything else is like 1/16 of the what has to be paid for in a budget, in a country's budget. But elsewhere, he records the opinion too that it may be that if America holds together as one continent spanning country, that there'll be a lot more peace in our future than we realize, because we will be a great power, and people will not be in a position to offend us or to harm us. So who knows? I mean, you could run that argument either way, and I think that's more or less still the case, except that as science has advanced and weapons have become more powerful, our zone of safety has diminished considerably, and it's been very hard for American politics to make the adjustments that it needs to make to continue to try to guarantee us the same kind of safety we've had in the past.
I think
there are many things it could do. I think, missile defense. My old friend Angelo's, that was his issue for decades, and it never really got built. I mean, we don't have a missile defense basically, except for the stray missile from North Korea that might head in our direction.
He was one of the SDI guys from the 80s. He was one of the
Yes, he
they're
was.
called Star
He worked for
Wars.
Malcolm Wallop
Mhm.
and for the Reagan administration, and he was instrumental in sort of drawing up the Star Wars idea. And he wrote a very good book called While Others Build, which was on everybody. I mean, other countries are building missile defense, we're not. And it's also still true, other countries are building nuclear weapons and we're not,
Right.
or not as many as we probably need to.
I
But I
remember
guess I
getting
have to
those.
excuse myself because
Okay.
I'm
Well,
in my
speaking of,
office hours, and there might
yeah,
be students lined up outside who want to come in.
speaking of having a reason for hope and uh, investing in the next generation is certainly a good reason to have some hope. So I definitely want your students to have as much access to you as possible for
Well,
for all of our sakes. Thanks for joining us, Charles
thank you.
Kesler.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great to see you. And best of luck to you. Stay in touch.